Hello again, everyone. It's a new week, which means yet another Cities Skylines 2 developer diary. Today's buzz is all about electricity, and also water and sewage. Last week, we went into city services in what was surely the longest dev diary we've gotten to date, and then today we have one of the shortest, but the news is no less exciting, and no less important. What's nice is we, both here on this channel, and of course the folks at Colossal Order themselves, have at least mentioned most of the stuff already regarding some of the biggest changes from Cities 1 to 2 regarding water and electricity. So what I want to focus on in this week's video are the big things that you need to know about how to handle these services in Cities 2 compared to Cities 1. A lot of the stuff is the same, but there are some big changes that will definitely change the way we do things and change what we're used to from Cities 1. So let's just get right into it.
Let's take a look at electricity. When laying roads, you also install low-voltage underground cables that supply electricity to homes, offices, and shops.
So right away, the biggest and most highly anticipated change is that pipes are under the roads, right where they belong, automatically. Finally. So no more nonsense of just the repetitive nature of having to draw your roads and then redraw the water pipes underneath it, and also just no more of the water pipe free-for-all anarchy of drawing them any which way you wanted with reckless abandon. It's all taken care of for you now. And with that out of the way, let's continue on to what is arguably the single most important part of the dev diary and how electricity functions in Cities 2.
These cables plug into transformer stations. Transformer stations are also connected to the high-voltage power lines streaming from your city's power plants. They act as a junction where low-voltage cables and high-voltage lines link up. Together, they form the grid that pumps electricity right across your city. There's one drawback. Power lines and electric cables can only carry so much electricity. When demand increases, they can max out, creating a bottleneck. Keep the grid humming by evenly spreading electricity connections around your city.
So, if you, like me, are not super familiar with how electrical grids work even in real life, this bit might sound a bit confusing at first, but it's really not. If I was able to make sense of it in my head, I have no fear that everyone else should be able to as well. But to put it into really simple terms, the biggest difference here is that unlike in Cities 1, where as long as there was just one connection point from your power source to any other building, power would jump endlessly from building to building without issue. So you could have all of your power producing plants and buildings in one area of your city, and as long as it was connected by one building, and all the buildings were connected to each other somehow, just close enough for that power to jump through, you could do that without any issue. It wouldn't matter that all of your power was being produced in one part of your city. But now that won't work. So think of it similarly to how if you had just one highway connection to your city. If you had only one point for people to get in and out, or to and from your highway and out of your city, it wouldn't work very well for long, right? So it's basically the same concept. If you have a large sprawling city, you're going to need to have different access points where that power connection will hook into your buildings or your power grid. And if we hop into the blog post, it explains it really well if we check out this bit. Each power line and electric cable has a maximum capacity which determines how much electricity they can carry. When that capacity is reached, a bottleneck forms, creating a disturbance in the distribution of electricity. So essentially, each power line or cable can only funnel through a certain amount of electricity, and once that limit is reached, problems start to arise. So you need to have more lines in other areas to keep funneling that electricity through your city. Or you can place a transformer down on the other side of that bottleneck to to bypass the bottleneck altogether. Which brings me to our next major difference from Cities 1 to Cities 2. Transformers are now a thing, as well as the addition of separating power into low and high voltages. So let's go back to the video to hear it explained again.
These cables plug into transformer stations. Transformer stations are also connected to the high-voltage power lines streaming from your city's power plants. They act as a junction where low-voltage cables and high-voltage lines link up. Together, they form the grid that pumps electricity right across your city.
So the transformers are essentially distribution centers for your city's electricity. The power plant produces the electricity at a high voltage level, and the high voltage power lines move that power to a transformer, which then converts the high voltage electricity into low voltage that is then distributed and used by the buildings in your city. So if we keep imagining things like a roadway system, think of the larger power lines as larger arterials and highways in your city that transport electricity over longer distances. Whereas the transformer is like a junction that then connects and distributes that power to smaller low voltage areas, or like collector and local roads essentially. And that's pretty much it. It just sort of breaks up that distribution into smaller parts that can be put in more places. So you don't have to have these big, huge, power lines through parts of your city. You can have smaller local lines and things like that, or they just go under the roads, and you don't need these big guys everywhere to connect your city up to power. So then if we hop back into the video, we get to the last major aspect of electricity production and use that you'll need to know to make a functioning city, which is just importing and exporting through outside connections.
You can also build power lines to import electricity from neighboring cities. Imported energy will save your bacon if local power plants fail to produce enough electricity when demand increases.
So this is the bit that was mentioned in other dev diaries a few times. You can both import and export electricity. So for example, right now in Cities 1, at the beginning of your city, like in particular, unless you're using wind power, you're pretty much always overproducing by a huge margin. And usually the answer is to just adjust your budget slider to produce less. Now, instead of that, you can just sell the excess and actually make money as opposed to just spending less money. And if you're having the opposite problem, where you're not producing enough, but maybe you don't have the funds for another power plant, or not the one that you want, or maybe you just are only missing a little bit of power and it doesn't make sense to build a whole new power plant, you can just import some to cover any gaps. So in essence, it works like this. You have two sources for your electricity, two possible sources. A power plant of some kind, which could be wind, coal, solar, oil, geothermal, and even water, or an outside source from another neighboring city. Then that power from that plant, it converts into high voltage electricity. From there, that goes to your transformers, converts it into low voltage electricity, which then gets sent out to your buildings. And it can work the same way in reverse. Your transformers can take the low voltage and convert it to high voltage, which then can be transferred back through those big those big towering power lines, and can either be stored in batteries that you might have in your city, or exported through outside connections for extra money. And then around and around it goes, basically. It's more in depth, but it's not more complicated. And it's also just more beneficial this way, as there's no more just wasted excess electricity or careful micromanagement of your budget. And that is essentially everything different about power in Cities 2. Everything else is essentially the same. Power usage can fluctuate depending on the weather, which we were able to experience with the Snowfall DLC. When it would get cold, your citizens would use higher amounts of electricity to warm their houses, yada yada. And power production can also fluctuate based on the weather in the case of like solar power plants, where they'll only produce electricity during the daylight hours and will rely on batteries during the night. Now, this wasn't mentioned, so it has me curious, but specifically of whether or not solar power production can increase during the winter months if there's snow on the ground via reflection, as can happen in the real world. So I wonder if that's going to be a thing in the game or not. As with a few other things, I may be going a little bit too in-depth with that, but it would be a neat feature since seasons are going to be a part of things. That's really all you need to know for electricity and about what's coming in Cities 2. Everything else about power will work the same as it does in Cities 1, so it should be easy to get used to in the new game. Now, onto sewage and water.
Let's talk water and sanitation. Surface water sources are the same as in Cities Skylines. Expect flowing rivers, glittering lakes, and vast, swirling oceans.
So good news here. It's exactly the same as it was in Cities 1. So getting used to setting up water should be easy peasy. Really, the only difference is that there's a functioning groundwater mechanic, which was mentioned in last week's dev diary. So if we keep going, we get to see exactly how that works.
Groundwater is different. These underground reservoirs replenish over time, so they can run dry if they're drained at a faster rate than they're refilled. They're also susceptible to ground pollution. When they're contaminated, dirty water is pumped into your city's freshwater system. That's bad on every level, mainly because decontamination takes a long time.
And that's it. Groundwater is now its own functioning mechanic. Groundwater deposits will have a refresh rate, and if your consumption is more than that refresh rate, the deposits can run dry, leaving you to have to go find another source. But everything else is essentially the same. While there weren't groundwater deposits that could get polluted, if you had a water tower in an area where the ground was polluted, for example, like in an industrial zone, it would get into the water, which ironically is not how water towers work in Cities 2, however. They can actually just be placed anywhere and have a limited amount of water supply that is not affected by ground pollution at all, which is nice because now we can place them anywhere we want for aesthetics. And then another just point to mention is that geothermal power plants have to be placed over groundwater deposits, and they will pollute the water source. So that's like another big Not like a huge difference, but it is something that you didn't have to worry about at all in City Skylines 1. You could just place a geothermal power plant anywhere and it was fine. Now you will have to pay a little bit more attention to that. But that is literally everything, my friends. The sewage system works exactly the same as before. Just don't shit where you drink. Keep your sewage outlets far away from your inlets and you're good to go. And then there's also still water treatment plants that can clean the sewage water and release clean water back into the system. And so that is everything new that you absolutely, positively need to know for these services to work in Cities 2 compared to Cities 1, which is great news because it's not all that different. I think with regard to these essential services, we'll all feel right at home with how to set these up in our cities. Managing them will be different, a bit more in depth, but altogether easier, which to me seems to basically be the trend for Cities 2. Increased depth resulting in increased ease. But by all means, feel free to let me know what your thoughts in the comments below. What'd you think of today's Dev Diary? I'd love to hear what you all think. But other than that, that's all I've got for you today. And if you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a like and or comment below. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. I'll have another video next week on the 7th Dev Diary about maps and themes, which I'm super, super excited about. I've just been like itching to get a better look at the maps since we got teased on them all a few weeks ago. So yeah, if you're looking forward to that as well, consider subscribing so you don't miss it. As always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, a wonderful rest of your week, and thank you so, so much for watching. Goodbye.